This is Brian. He doesn't like Thomas Hardy. Don't be like Brian. Hardy wrote 14 novels, and I thought it would be fun to troll Brian and people like him by ranking and reviewing them. I'm going to rank every Hardy novel out of 10 on the 4 M's of Hardy books: misery, melodrama, misogynist men, and maidenly maidens. That's right, if you're stuck for adjectives, I recommend reusing the noun. A score of high or low on this scale does not actually represent whether the book is good or bad. It just gives you an idea of the flavour of how hardy it is. It represents their profile. The first 2 M's are pretty self-explanatory, and I'm rating men on their toxicity. The more toxic, the higher the score. And the women? I'm ranking them on their general awesomeness. The more likeable, the better the score. And by likeable, I mean I like reading about them, not I like hanging out with them. Nobody wants to be friends with Arabella, but she makes a good character. I'm also going through them from worst to best in my expert Hardy opinion. We're going to start with done because we are too many, and that's because some Thomas Hardy novels have been done better by Thomas Hardy. And we're going to finish with the category I called Jude the Obscure. Before I get into the Hardy novels, I want to discuss some themes that are in every single Hardy novel, or almost every single Hardy novel, to save me repeating myself 14 times. All Hardy novels have a protagonist who is often a woman, but who is always working class, and at some point they have a plan to improve their place in life, to move up the social ranks. And Hardy will show you the societal structures preventing their progress. He is incredibly socially critical. He is a socialist. He is often labelled a feminist, although I think all he does is see people. And he acknowledges that women are often the most unfortunate and their situation is not the same as men. He sees his characters. He's painting unfortunate situations again and again. You should always look for an interpretation of Hardy's work that is critical of power structures, be it the church, the patriarchy, money, class, or something else. And that is why so many of Hardy's novels are miserable. Hardy also liked to talk about faith, determinism, morality and ethics, love, marriage and courting. Almost every novel will have some sort of complex love triangle, a love pentagon, often 3 or 4 suitors per woman. Expect dramatic plot twists. Hardy loved a bit of miscommunication. He is a master foreshadower, and he is very good at changing the pacing of his novel based on what he thinks is best. Now you know what to expect. Let's get on with the books. The Hand of Ethelberta. It's not just me who didn't like this one, but Hardy's friend and fellow author George Gissing was quoted as saying, "Surely old Hardy's poorest book." It's actually kind of weird. Publication-wise, it comes in between 2 of Hardy's best novels, Far from the Madding Crowd and The Return of the Native. It seems weird to drop in his poorest novel just when he's getting things right. But this is a comedy, and like all good dad jokes, it doesn't matter if anybody else finds your joke funny, as long as you do. It might even be better if you get some disapproval from your readers. Be prepared to ask, was that a joke, multiple times? Otherwise, this is such a stereotypical example of Hardy's character writing. Ethelberta has love choices. She wants to be a writer, and so often in Hardy's novels, we see a woman who is paralysed by wanting to do the right thing and getting pressured by the men in her life. Hardy then adds in this twist of class. If Bertha, as she is nicknamed, wants to be a writer, what does that say about her husband and his ability to provide? Can women even write books? Well, that was a legitimate Victorian debate. It did come after the Brontes, George Eliot and Jane Austen. This has a lot of the elements of Hardy's best novels. It's not that this isn't a good book or that the design is faulty. It's that there's just so many examples where Hardy does this one better. Misery 2, Melodrama 4, Misogynist Men 5, Maidenly Maidens 4. The Well-Beloved, a sketch of a temperament. Technically Hardy's last novel, although it was serialised before Jude, it wasn't published until after Jude. It's weird when Hardy is at the very peak of his writing, he produces The Well-Beloved. To be fair, I think this aged really badly. Hardy is just very critical of a certain aspect of Victorian society, which I won't label to avoid spoilers. But there's this thing that used to happen in Victorian society, and to be honest, still happens today, all the time. But the way Hardy has decided to examine it and ridicule it is weird, and it makes the whole book kind of peculiar. This is one of those novels where Hardy decides to make the problematic man the protagonist. Hardy's books are full of the problematic men he witnessed in Victorian society, and Jocelyn Pearson is one such man. As readers, we kind of want to sympathise with our protagonist. And I think this is the reason why another one of Hardy's novels, The Mayor of Casterbridge, is such a divisive book. The thing is, Michael Henchard, the Mayor of Casterbridge, is both way more problematic than Pearson and has a redemption arc. Henchard is both easier to like and easier to hate. Yes, Pearson is problematic, but he's really not that bad. He's much more of a silly old man by the end of the novel, and you don't really wish him any harm. I mean, he's still a manipulative predator, so you can get behind it a little bit, but by Hardy's standards, he's tame. Hardy is very much an author who you can spoil, but also that a lot of the people who are reading Hardy won't care about spoilers. They're not that interested in plot. So if you want to know what the problematic thing is, I'm happy to tell you in the comments section. This is Hardy's multi-generational saga, and I just don't think it's held up over the years. Misery 2, Melodrama 3, Misogynist Men 5, Maidenly Maidens 5. A Pair of Blue Eyes. Part of the legacy of Thomas Hardy is the invention of the term cliffhangers. Back in the day when books were serialized in newspapers, Hardy left a character hanging on a cliff at the end of one chapter, leaving interested readers desperate to find out what happened to him and having to buy the next edition of the newspaper. Hence the term cliffhanger. Elfriede Swancourt is the daughter of a vicar. She meets and falls in love with Stephen Smith. Smith is not of Elfriede's class, and Elfriede is also pursued by Henry Knight, her father's assistant. It's only a love triangle, and Hardy couldn't even be bothered thinking of proper names for his men. This is Hardy's third novel, and the first novel where I really think that he's doing what he does in his later novels. It's just not really that complex yet. If you're a Hardy purist, you can see his style develop with this novel. You can see what he is doing, where he's going, and how he builds upon this sort of idea. His writing is there, but it's just not messy or complex. This is the first real Thomas Hardy book, but everything he does later is an improvement upon this book. This book is fine. This book is actually good, but it's only really for completionists. Misery 7, Melodrama 4, Misogynist Men 5, Maidenly Maidens 4. The Woodlanders. This was Hardy's favourite of his novels, and I think it will surprise a few people to see this novel so far down the list. This is a lot of people's favourite Hardy novel. And this is everything Hardy does. Problematic characters, innocent characters being preyed upon, class divides, miserable plot twists, but it never hit me like his other novels. Grace Melbury is the lady of the area. Marty South is a poor local girl, and as if to emphasise the class difference between them, Grace literally buys Marty's hair at one point in this novel. Grace is courted by Fitzpierre, a local doctor, and Giles, a woodsman. Marty is also interested in Giles, but Giles makes it pretty clear that he likes Grace. Meanwhile, Grace's affections move between the two men, and Fitzpierre is a bit of the bastard of this novel. Hardy sets up this situation where somebody is going to be miserable, where there isn't an outcome you can really hope for that sees all of the characters happy. And then, in typical Hardy fashion, he continues to complicate things. This is such a typical Hardy book, and don't be put off by my lukewarm opinion of this novel. I actually really like this book. It is just more of a testament to the good books that are still to come that this one is so low. Misery 5, Melodrama 6, Misogynist Men 6, Maidenly Maidens 4. A Laodicean. It is rumoured that this is a semi-autobiographical novel. Hardy wrote it when he was sick and assumed to be on his deathbed, but he got better. George Somerset is an architect, and so was Hardy before he was a writer, although it seems unlikely that Somerset was a self-inspired character. We see Hardy's opinions on his former career. Nothing scandalous, but we get to see what he thinks of various building techniques. Hardy gets to be a building nerd, And while that sort of conversation went well over my non-architect head, it does serve as part of a rivalry between George Somerset and Mr. Havel, Havel being a more conservative and resistant to new ideas sort of chap. The relationship can be seen as metaphorical for the clash of old ideas with new ideas. What is kind of cool about this book is that both men, Somerset and Havel, are competing for Paula Powers. But for Havel, at least, it is only for her business. Power is the Laodicean of the title, which is a term for somebody who is lukewarm or lacking conviction when it comes to religion. Maybe they only attend church on the holidays or sporadically, but it isn't Power's religion that the title refers to, but her commitment to life, her apathy and indecision, and included in that is both her romantic life and the choice of builder to restore her property. Power has inherited a large estate and speaks to Somerset and Havel about doing some work for her. She is romantically attached to Captain de Stancy, but develops feelings for Somerset, unsure over who she prefers. This novel would be far better known if Hardy simply didn't outdo it later in his career. This is part of a set of middle novels that are just really good books, but that are also inferior to his later work. Don't start with them, but if you enjoy Hardy, you'll enjoy these middle novels. Misery 3, Melodrama 6, Misogynist Men 3, Maidenly Maidens 5. Desperate Remedies. Hardy's first novel, and this is not what you think of when you think of Thomas Hardy. Hardy enjoyed Wilkie Collins, and this is a sensationalist novel, the Victorian precursor to our thriller. While out of place in his collection of works, you can still pick it as him. This is Victorian trash. Very enjoyable Victorian trash. But it does contain a lot of textbook Hardy themes. Exploration and criticism of social class, women struggling against societal structures, moral ambiguity, love, desire, and fate. You can see the pieces of this novel that Hardy liked and he kept in his future novels. He loved throwing in plot twists, probably just to upset his characters. Cytherea Grey is forced by poverty to accept a job as a lady's maid to Miss Eldcliffe. And this is about all the plot I want to reveal, because even the very identities of who these characters are to each other is a plot twist. Cytherea is in love with Edward, who I can't tell you anything about because, again, plot twist. There's another man involved in this because it's Thomas Hardy and all women need to have multiple suitors, most of who are undesirable. Again, I don't want to tell you who this other man is and how he fits into Hardy's plot. Look, with any sensationalist novel, there are a lot of things that happen that are possible, but very improbable. It's a wild ride. You don't know what's going to happen next. But, and this is a weird thing, if you read this not knowing Thomas Hardy was the author, you would be asking if Thomas Hardy wrote a sensationalist novel. And it's really clear he could have been a successful author in the genre. I'm glad he didn't go down that path, but this novel is legit really enjoyable. If Hardy is just too miserable for you, read this one. It's still miserable, but it's not as serious. Misery 3, Melodrama 8, Misogynist Men 8, Maidenly Maidens 4. Under the Greenwood Tree. It's Dick and Fancy. I want to say this is the most disappointing set of names in any Hardy novel, but also I'm a child and I find them funny. Fancy Day is new to the village. Remember high school? The new girl is always considered hot. In typical Hardy fashion, she doesn't attract one man, but three. Dick Dewey, a member of the local choir, James Shiner, the church organist, and Mr. Maybold, the new church vicar. In even more typical Hardy fashion, at least one of these men is not a particularly nice person. But this only gets slowly revealed as the romantic fate of Fanny gets quite complicated. This was Hardy's second novel, and it is shortest and one of his simplest novels. Central to this novel is the idea of trust, moral ambiguity, and rural life. You have to read this novel right to the very end, and it is surprisingly dark. Misery 3, Melodrama 3, Misogynist Men 3, Maidenly Maidens 5. The Trumpet-Major. Set during the Napoleonic Wars, this is the story of John Loveday, a soldier, a trumpet-major, his brother Bob Loveday, and Anne Garland, who both brothers have feelings for. John and Bob are both in love with Anne, being brothers and basically nice chaps. Upon learning of the feelings their brother had towards Anne, they do the only right thing they can think of. They ask Anne who she likes better, Sorry, no, they wouldn't be hardy men if they considered what the woman wanted. Instead, they leave Anne to the romantic advances of their brother. This is complicated by the war with France, causing John to be absent for parts of the plot, and Festus Derryman, who is, of all Hardy's terrible, toxic men, he may actually be the worst. He really gives Alec d'Urberville a close run. All of this leaves Anne confused, angry, in fear of her life. That's mostly Derryman's fault. And she doesn't know which brother she loves. Maybe it's neither. I actually really like Anne. She's strong and independent, but still quite changeable of mind and not decisive. These are traits that don't often go together, and I really enjoy seeing that. Again, this is another middle book, and you can see Hardy starting to hit his stride with these books. He's producing consistently good quality books here. Misery 5, Melodrama 6, Misogynist Men 10, Maidenly Maidens 6. Two on a Tower. This, I think, is one of Hardy's absolute best novels, with the worst ending in all of literature. It's so bad, it's become comically good. If you were going to take the piss out of a novel with an intentionally bad ending, I'm not sure you could outdo this. So bad, it's kind of good, but for all the wrong reasons. Lady Constantine is a young but wealthy widow. Swyneth St. Cleeve, isn't that a good name? You know he's the major character because he's got the weird name, is a young astronomer, and he uses the observatory at Welham House, the small piece of land Lady Constantine owns. Lady Constantine develops an interest in first astronomy, but then also in Swyneth. An interest that is returned. But this is a Hardy novel, and if we were centering Lady Constantine, there would be other suitors for her. But instead we're centering Swyneth, the man, and he's not going to be allowed to have a happy life because he's a working class chap with ambition. In this case, those ambitions are because he's fallen in love with a woman from a completely different class, and not because he wants money, because if he wanted money, Hardy would have centered Lady Constantine. Also, I lied to you about one thing. Lady Constantine does have another suitor. It's a Hardy novel. Captain de Stancy, a man of the right breeding. Seriously, you have to read this to the end. You will vomit, but otherwise this is a seriously good book. Misery 7, Melodrama 8, Misogynist Men 2, and Maidenly Maidens 5. Time for the top 5. I've read all these books twice. There's no surprises here. These are the basic Becky Hardy books. Because when it comes to Thomas Hardy, I'm basic. Is anybody really a super fan of an author and prefer their obscure works? If Jane Austen is your favourite, you're not going to say Pride and Prejudice is a bit average. I mean, it's fine, but it's not in your top 5. And to prove that, just look in the comment section of this video. It's certainly not going to be full of people telling me how they love Austen books, except for that one where Elizabeth meets Darcy. Back to Hardy. The Return of the Native. This book doesn't have one of my favourite ever characters in it. It has two in all of literature. Diggory Venn and Eustacia Vi. Yet it's Clym Yeobright who this novel centres. He is the native who is returning. This is, in my opinion, the most quintessentially Hardy book there is. It's not the best, but it's just so Hardy. We have a love pentagon. Thomasin Yeobright, Clym Yeobright. Yes, they're related. No, they're not romantically interested in each other. They're not cousins. We also have Eustacia Vi, Damon Wildeve, and Diggory Venn. Eustacia was dating Damon, but is interested in Clym. Damon is interested in Thomasin, but also wouldn't mind Eustacia back. Diggory is also interested in Thomasin, but he's a redder man and hence mysterious, and Clym doesn't really understand what's happening. In Egdon Heath, we have this really strong rural setting that is both mysterious and at times creepy. It's very witchy, but it captures this homely and nostalgic vibes that it has in our characters' hearts. This rural feel is further added to it by Diggory, who sells redder, which is basically a substance they use to mark sheep to determine which farmer they belong to. Diggory is constantly red because of this substance that he carries everywhere, and is a real bit of an otherworldly character. But he is also quite well off from selling redder. He has a code of ethics that I can really get behind, and potentially he has superpowers. We have the proud, driven, strong-willed Eustacia. Some people will find her very hard to empathise with, saying she is overly goal-driven, manipulative and conniving. But I don't think it's that simple. She is fierce and fiery, but only when somebody is trying to step on her toes. And yes, she is goal-driven, but that's not a flaw. I completely completely love the balance of hard and soft, of fiery and victim that she is. I think she is one of literature's most misjudged characters, but she is definitely written to be morally ambivalent. But I can't help supporting her. Eustacia is in a relationship with Damon Wildeve at the beginning of this novel, but she wants to see and experience the world, to live in Paris. Wildeve only really wants to be rich. The only thing he wants to see and experience are the contents of Eustacia's undergarments. And they go their own separate ways, and Wildeve focuses on Thomasin, while Eustacia is happy being on her own. That is, until Klim is returning from Paris. She falls in love with him. Some would say maybe even before she meets him. This is a book about trust and mistrust. You are meant to compare Damon, who is horrible, to Eustacia. How are they treating the people around them? But they're not the same characters. And this book for me is one of Hardy's most feminist works. Also, this book has some disabled rep in it too. One of the characters loses their sight. Misery 8, Melodrama 9, Misogynist Men 7, Maidenly Maidens 10. The Mayor of Casterbridge, the life and death of a man of character. One of the most divisive Thomas Hardy novels, but I love this portrait of toxic masculinity. This novel starts with Michael Henchard, who is a nasty alcoholic who is in the process of getting drunk and gets upset with his wife and baby, and does what any nasty alcoholic would do, sells them in a pub auction. Actually, nobody would do that. That's ridiculous. But nonetheless, Susan and Elizabeth Jane are soon sold to Richard Newson, a Scottish sailor who thought Henchard was acting terribly and wanted to put an end to things, yet somehow stayed married to Susan. Having lost his family, Henchard swears off the drink, and then we jump forward 15 to 20 years, and Henchard has become Mayor of Casterbridge. This is a common working class man who both has a past and has moved up in class. You know what's coming next. At the same time, Elizabeth Jane is grown up and attracting suitors and needs to be reintroduced to the plot. Hardy has, I think, started with one of his most horrible men, filled him with misery, guilt and regret, and then let him soak for the best part of 2 decades. The events at the beginning of this novel are literally half his lifetime ago, and it's perfectly reasonable to think that a character might have changed in such times, which he has, but it's also reasonable to think that such a character may be unchanged, which is also true. The fascinating part of this novel is to place together the pieces of Henchard that have grown and the pieces that are unchanged, and to see if a man can ever change. I said at the beginning that this is a portrait of toxic masculinity, but it's for you to decide if it's a portrait of a toxic man. Does he redeem himself, or is he unchanged? Misery 9, Melodrama 8, Misogynist Men 10, Maidenly Maidens 6. Far from the madding crowd. The book that made Hardy, that put him on the literary map, his first big success. This is often called the least miserable of Hardy's novels, which is selling it considerably short. It is the least miserable of my top 5, but you'd need to be the CEO of a multinational company to read this and think that it wasn't miserable. We have what I think is the best character in all of literature, Bathsheba Everdeen, who is young and coquettish, intelligent and proud. Much like with Eustacia Vi, we have this combination of hard and soft, strong and weak, independent but in need of help, which is cool because this is basically a girl boss story too. Bathsheba inherits a farm and nobody thinks she can run it. But she's going to run it, I tell you, or rather, she'll tell you. I also really enjoy reading about young characters who are not fully developed and seeing what shapes them. Prior to the farm inheritance, we have Gabriel Oakes, Farmer Oakes, who has his own farm and who meets Bathsheba, falls in love and suggests marriage to her. I love that Bathsheba doesn't really know what she wants. And Oakes isn't a horrible sounding husband, but she requires some convincing, so turns him down, assuming that she is so desirable that Oakes will want to convince her. Oakes, being one of the few honourable men in all of Hardy's literature, says to himself, well, she said no, she must have her reasons, I won't bother her again. They go their own separate way. Bathsheba, as we have already said, inherits a farm. Oakes disinherits his farm by process of it burning down. Then there's Farmer Boldwood, a neighbouring farmer who has never even considered taking a wife. But we have already discussed, the new girl is always at least 20 to 50% more attractive than anybody else. He develops a little crush on Bathsheba, a crush that was not at all due to Bathsheba's own foolishness. Lastly, there is Sergeant Francis Troy. I don't like Troy, so I wanted to redact him from this video, but he's so important to the themes and the meat of what Hardy is doing here. And there is some fantastic writing which explains Troy's feelings during a moment of grief. It's absolutely horrible. However, if there's one scene in this novel that sums up, I want to say this book, but really all Hardy, it's the scene with the exploding sheep. Hardy gets to use his fascinating knowledge of obscure things that can happen in rural life, such as sheep exploding, and runs it up against this headstrong character in Bathsheba, who is digging in her heels on two very different issues. One, not talking to a person who has upset her, the one person who can save her sheep from exploding, or two, failing as a farmer and giving in to the doubters. It is simply a cruel situation for Hardy to put Bathsheba in, and it's a situation that gives us much insight into her character, and not just in what she picks, but in the manner and how she picks it. It is truly an iconic Hardy scene. Misery 6, Melodrama 7, Misogynist Men 8, Maidenly Maidens 10. 2 to go, and we're up to the categories I've called Jude the Obscure. So let's start there. My first time reading this book, this instantly became my number one Hardy novel. It wasn't until a reread that this novel was overtaken. A reread of another novel. This is a novel that upset Victorian England so much they cancelled Hardy. If by cancelled you mean complained at him until he got very upset and decided never to write another book. A lot of Hardy's books are critical of the power structures that existed inside Victorian society, and of course one of those structures is the church. And that's reflected by the fact that a bishop publicly burnt a copy of Jude the Obscure upon reading it. But the aspects of the church Hardy's criticising, they're aspects that the majority of modern day people would also criticise. You're not going to be scandalised in the same way the Victorians were, but you will be scandalised. And if you have a specific trigger warning you would like to know about before reading books, and if that trigger warning is related to children, please look this book up on Storygraph. It is a massive spoiler, but mental health first, please. Jude is a young working class man who wants to be educated. He teaches himself Greek and reads Homer, Plato and various Greek and Roman classics. Oh dear Jude, you're in a novel written by the wrong author. Hardy will go about taking away all the things you've ever loved, with enough separation between each removal so that you can feel the pain and loss of each thing individually, but not enough time so that you can heal. But if you think Jude is the poor tortured soul in this novel, well, you have a pretty good point actually. But there's also poor Sue. Sue is Jude's cousin, and I think we've all read enough Victorian literature to know what that's code for. Jude and Sue's romance is looked down upon by the rest of society, and no, not because they were cousins. Random fact, some historians think that up to 60% of marriages were historically between first cousins. Jude and Sue's romance is looked down upon because they're both divorced. Why don't I own a pair of pearls so I can clutch at them? Arabella, Jude's first wife, is such a likeable villain. She's self-centered, double-crossing, hedonistic, and uses her body to get what she wants. She's a real Becky Sharp type character, full of life and somebody who would be really fun to have a drink with. But you may wake up the next morning in an ice bath, sans kidneys. Mr. Philistine, Sue's first husband, is the opposite. He's serious with a moral code. Sue is terrified of having sex with him when they first get married, and he doesn't pressure her, which for a man in a Hardy novel is basically the same as turning water into wine and feeding the masses. He does have a harsher side to him. He believes what he believes, and he doesn't lie. When Sue leaves him, he considers if he is obligated to force her to stay, to look out for her soul. I quite like this corrupt way of thinking. Honourable men contemplating doing something horrible. It's a good insight into what Hardy is criticising. If you have not read this book yet, this will be the most depressing book you have ever read. Misery 11, Melodrama 8, Misogynist Men 4, Maidenly Maidens 7. We are about to reveal what I think the best Hardy novel is. But before I do that, subscribe. You've made it this far in the video, you can't be talking about how you have good taste. Just subscribe. The best Thomas Hardy novel? Tess of the D'Urbervilles. A pure woman, faithfully presented. I told you, when it comes to Hardy, I'm basic. But you know what I don't understand? In an era where World Eats Woman is basically the most popular literary subgenre, why hasn't this book exploded? A pure woman faithfully presented. That's all you need to know about this novel. A woman who does everything society asks of her in every situation, but still comes up the victim. Tess, Angel and Alec is a relatively simple love triangle, especially by Hardy's standards. But it works. Alec is quite simply the worst man Hardy ever wrote. Also, he's very rich. Coincidence? Hashtag Hardy was a commie. Alec is a d'Urberville. Despite the title of this novel, Tess isn't. She's a Derbyfield. Tess's father finds proof that he was descended from the d'Urbervilles, and that he is the rightful Lord, Duke, CEO, Vampire Leech, I don't know, of the land. So he does what any important person does. Sends his daughter in to figure things out, like sending a lamb to ask for water from Nestle. Alec is without morals, and presented with a young and attractive woman alone, without a chaperone, and who may or may not be his distant cousin. What do you think he's going to do? Angel Clare is the third son of a wealthy churchman, and he is studying farming with a view to buying land in Australia or Brazil and settling there. And by studying, I mean working at a local farm in the hopes of learning things. The same farm where Tess works as a milkmaid. Poor Tess. Both men who are interested in you are of much higher class. Whatever shall happen. You're going to spend the entirety of this novel hating on Alec. Everybody does. It's completely fair. And as such, it's very easy to miss Angel's faults. Because the whole time, you're shipping Angel and Tess because Angel is not Alec. Tess, for her part, poor Tess. If you've read both Tess and Jude, tell me, who do you think has it worse? It's not that clear. Misery 10, Melodrama 11, Misogynist Men 10, Maidenly Maidens 9. This is a fantastic novel. Well, that's the end. Please remember to like this video unless you hated it, in which case, why did you watch the entire video? Be nicer to yourself. Practice some self-care. Eat some cake. Have a bath. Cuddle a puppy. I'm going to do another video like this with another author I love. I've already read their entire back catalogue of. I know who it is. But let me know in the comments, is there somebody else you'd like me to do a video like this about? And tell me about your experience reading Thomas Hardy. I hope you'll pick up a Hardy novel soon and you'll be joining us for Misery May, a Thomas Hardy readathon. Links are in the show notes. Bye bye.